and thematics and everything else that happened. Once it finally passed, and I got myself off the floor because I was just shocked that it actually passed, because I knew how instrumental and impactful that was going to be. Was it perfect? No, because I do have a lot of folks say, well, why didn't y'all add this, or why didn't you make it that way? Well, the process is that we write the bill, we give it over to Ledge Council, they chop it up, and it's out of our control at that time. But either way, so once that passed at TASA, what we decided to do, because I didn't want this to be another bill that we were going to pat ourselves on the back and then just let it go. So I thought, no, we've got 254 counties in Texas. We're mandating SART coverage for adult sexual assault survivors. So I wanted to make sure that we, we're careful and intentional about that. So we put together a steering committee, and then we decided we needed to hire someone that could have that pulse. And it wasn't just anyone, like we needed that special unicorn of a person to take that position. And so I'm so excited this morning to have a conversation with that special unicorn of a person whose name is Deepika Modali. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Deepika. It's a little slow, but it's coming. VIP. Let's kick it. Oh God, I don't know how to sit. Testing. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I know I look awkward. I cannot sit in a chair. I mean, I'm too old now. I don't know. Shit. Okay. All right, everybody. Hi, Deepika.
Hi.
How are you?
How is everybody?
You can hear more music like that tonight.
Yes.
At the event downtown Denton.
Because we have to stop, collaborate, and listen, or start, collaborate, and listen.
How late with her shirt.
There is a t-shirt.
So Deepika, thank you for being here. I'm excited. So I will not say any more things. I'm just going to ask you questions now so you can talk about all the wonderful things. So I would like to start for us to learn more about you personally. So can you tell us a little bit about you, and starting with, what is your favorite food?
Oh yes, favorite food. I would say chicken curry. It's comforting. I'm a child of immigrant parents from India, so that is my comfort food. And then I also love cheese, because who doesn't?
Cheese is good. What is if you could consider one of your skill sets a superpower, what is your superpower?
Okay, so it's kind of a silly one, but I think could be beneficial in so many ways. It would be, I would be the spice, and I would add spice to any type of food to make it better, but then I could also add things that don't taste good to my enemies.
If you don't get your sarts together,
don't get your sarts together, it's coming.
It's coming. So also I know that Deepika, when we were looking after the bill passed, and then I was able to get a steering committee together, a statewide steering committee together, because again, I wanted to make sure that this wasn't going to be another one of those bills that TASA passed that just sits on the shelf of good intention.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't want that to happen. This is way too important. So, we put together a steering committee that includes a governor's office. It was TASA. We had the county judges, county commissioners and judges association. We had the Texas district, and then the district DAs. I don't know, the association for the DAs, that one. We had the Texas Chief of Police Association and some other great people at the table. So we got them together, and they were really helpful in helping us get the word out and us being consistent with our different constituents. So the next thing was that we needed to hire somebody that could continue that work and ensure that we did implement. So we hired you, like we wanted you. We're like, please come work for us. So can you tell us a little bit about your professional life before TASA, and then also how that led into your work with the SARTs?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my degree is in advertising and marketing. So nothing in like the helping social work activist field. But it was something that I was always passionate about and wanted to get involved in. So, back in 2010, when I moved to Austin, I got involved with Safe Alliance, doing hospital accompaniment there and eventually doing trainings. I was part of one of their first groups of peer support groups that they were doing in the shelter. So that was kind of where I got started. So one thing I want to stress too is if you're someone that wants to do the work or you're interacting with folks that want to be in the movement, but maybe haven't gotten that degree and are thinking, can I still do this work? There are ways to do that, like volunteering and getting involved in your community. There's so many ways to serve survivors. And then after that, I was in Dallas and I got involved with a culturally specific organization there, Chafna. And then when I moved to Austin, got involved with Asian Family Support Services. Woo! And I'd been there for years. And while I was there, we served a 10 county area in Central Texas. And with doing so, I got the opportunity to attend a variety of different SART. And so with that, I got to see what it looked like to, interact with folks at a rural SART as well as the SARTs in Travis County and Williamson County, and see what that looked like. And I actually was the coordinator at the Travis County SART for 2 years.
So when you worked at APSFA, so
Mhm.
y'all's coverage area was such that you were able to interact with the different SARTs,
Yes.
including rural SARTs
Mhm.
and
Yes.
urban. Wow,
Yeah.
that is great. I didn't realize that. Okay, so can you in that work, I know that what you said earlier, that you were a marketing degree. I have a marketing degree too, so I knew we connected. But no, when you mentioned about that and getting, folks involved, and you were young when you got interested in this work, really quickly, do you have any thoughts or ideas on how we can get younger people? I'm Gen X, and I am one that just truly believes that Gen Z is going to be what turns us all around in a positive way. I really, really believe. Are there any Gen Zers in here? Yay, 2 or 3. Oh, there you
Oh,
are.
yes,
Right
yes.
there's a lot on y'all shoulders. I really feel like y'all are gonna change the world in a really good way. I truly believe that. But in that, do you see any opportunities for us to involve the younger generation in the way that you became involved?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to think about that every generation brings something different to the movement and how they do the work. So, how I'm an elder millennial. And so, how we do the work is very different than maybe Gen X or Gen Z. And so just thinking about meeting them where they're at, utilizing social media and thinking that just because someone doesn't necessarily work at an agency or comes to conferences or does that kind of work doesn't mean they're not on the ground organizing, working with the community. So really looking at that when you're out in the community, like, hey, I noticed that this person is actually going out there and talking with a lot of folks. I wonder what they're doing.
Thank you. And I'll ask this question later, but remind me if I don't,
Okay.
how we could get, like when we're talking about SARTs, getting young people at that table at the SART
Okay.
might be, anyway. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that if I
Yeah.
forget to ask. Sorry. So many, every time I talk to you, I just get so inspired with all the things. So my next question for you, Deepika, is, now that you've been in the position at TASA, so like I said, we kind of got the law passed. We were very excited, and then we got a steering committee together. The other thing that TASA did is we had a ton of informational sessions. We teamed up with those folks on the SART committee, the statewide steering committee for the SART implementation plan. We got those folks together, brought you in. Can you tell us a little bit about the SART status then and what it is now and how that changed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to shout out too that I know there might have been folks in this room as well that were involved in those information sessions, and they were really important and really informed what went into the bill and what really TASA wanted to incorporate. So the things that Rose was mentioning maybe didn't make it in are things that we're still thinking about because we got to talk to folks across the state and get their input. So before the bill, there were about, I think it was like 33% of the counties in Texas had SARTs already in their communities. It was about, I think 23 or 40 something 23 teams with like 95 counties. And now we're up to 60 plus teams and we're around 125 counties. So we're almost at 50%, which is amazing. And we're just going to keep going.
Yes, yes. But that is amazing, really, when you think about, and I remember we were working with the governor's office and they were very involved in wanting to know how many SARTs we had. The policy team, Liz's team, like a year or two ago, did like surveys, called everybody to find out. And yeah, we came up with the same, it was just like 20 something. And some of them were not even functional, like they weren't really meeting regularly. So to now know that we've grown to that amount is so much better. So so I know that you said you were locally and that you were attending the different SARTs. Can you share a time or a couple of times when the SARTs experienced difficulties, and did y'all overcome that? If you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. So as y'all probably know, especially being in the advocacy space, we work with a lot of different organizations and systems, and putting everyone together in one room can be really powerful. But there's also a lot of personalities and a lot of different things that are trying to get achieved that maybe don't always mesh well together, right? So I think, what we've seen is I have had the opportunity to see kind of several different levels of what that looks like on bigger SARTs as well as more rural. And, it's really all about communication, right? We have to stop and talk. And so it's great to all be in the room together, but sometimes we have to think about, is there historical issues that have been there before? I was just talking to a SART a couple months ago, and one of the things that they were wanting was for us to come in and talk a little bit more about conflict resolution, because they were realizing that there were some really deep-seated conversations and things that had happened years ago that hadn't been resolved, which means, we also need to be thinking about, oh, how can that impact? And then that's eventually going to impact how they work with survivors together, even if those different entities do, have the same goal of serving them. I've also seen situations where several entities like the advocacy organizations, as well as sheriff's office and law enforcement, we're all trying to serve survivors in different ways, but there was just a miscommunication on how they could work together. And so, for a time, that SART ended up kind of, taking a break from each other and splitting off. And so, and kind of realized after some time that the only way to really do this work, to really serve survivors, is that we all have to be at the table and we all have to be communicating. And so to come back together, there had to be a lot of individual conversations. There was, we have to think about how we can connect. And we also have to think about who should be having those individual connections, right? If there's a lot of history, it may not be the best idea to send two of the folks in that already have had those conversations and it wasn't quite meshing. Maybe bring someone new into the group. And I also think too, folks see that, right? Our community sees that when people are not getting along, and that does affect whether survivors want to come and report. I know for, recently when we had the district attorney's office elections in Travis County, one of the things that was a big platform was we want a SART. We want to make sure there's a SART team. And that was a very important thing. And that was something that survivors were asking for, and making sure. And I've seen that across the state too, when survivors realize that are people in the community that are getting together, whether it's monthly or bi-monthly, and actually talking about what's going on. They want to see that, and that makes them feel more comfortable coming forward and utilizing resources.
So Deepika, you mentioned in the Travis County SART, and in one way, I wonder what you think about what I'm about to say. I feel like at some level, I know that there was an election change, so that was bringing in new people. I know that before that you said there was kind of a split. Do you, in my mind, it's kind of like the SART kind of worked on behalf of survivors. From what I remember, I think it was like the advocates and a core group that were like, you know, cases are not getting through. And then others who just didn't want to really hear that. So in a sense, I felt like, in my opinion, it kind of worked, although it needed some time to repair. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, Yeah, I agree. It did need some time to repair, but it also gave us the chance to kind of regroup and work together. And I think another thing that, you mentioned, you were talking about a change of folks and
Mhm.
change of members, right? One thing that I think SART should be thinking about is like what it looks like when folks inevitably leave the SART or go to another organization. How do we make sure that that information is continued to be shared, right? And so I feel like I'm plugging this a lot, but that's why the protocols are so important for those of you that came to my session yesterday, because that is a way for folks to kind of know. And also, if we're having these conversations when new folks are coming in about what was working before and what we think we can do forward, that will just continue on for the SART to work and serve survivors.
So it's almost like a sustainability plan. Because I also
Yeah.
heard before this that, one of the major concerns was that, you'll have someone that's very passionate at the local level leading the SART, but then let's just say they hit the lotto and take off somewhere, then
Yeah.
the SART dies. And so we don't
Right.
want that to happen. So
No.
protocols, are you
Right.
the same
Protocols
thoughts?
and succession planning, right? It doesn't always have to start over. I remember years ago when I was on one of the SART teams, and they had one of my advocates who was attending with me had actually mentioned, I know that the SART has done good work before I was part of the SART as well, but it feels like we're continually starting over every time you do a steering committee change or you have a different coordinator. So making sure you have stuff written down, maybe also thinking about having a welcoming committee or someone that, after someone new joins your SART, that they, stay on that Zoom or, meet with them after the SART meeting to kind of give them a rundown of what the SART looks like. Also introducing these members in your meetings and giving them a little bit of a spotlight too.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. My next question for you is, what specific skill sets do you feel are necessary to run a SART effectively?
So running a SART effectively, it's like using your advocacy skills times 100, because you're speaking to a lot of different folks, right? It's a lot of different personalities. So I think being able to be patient and take a step back, being willing to communicate, being willing to take the time to have those one-on-one conversations. And again, talking about those advocacy skills. And I think one of the things that TASA has recommended is that the presiding officer or the coordinator of your SART be housed in some way with your local crisis center. And part of that is we want to make sure that advocates are at the table. Y'all are so, so important and need to be there. And also, I think there's just a way that the skill sets that I'm talking about, communication, being patient, being able to take a step back, I think are so important. And we just want to make sure that y'all also have the best interests of our survivors at heart, right? Y'all are the ones that are working with them one-on-one and can really advocate for them. And so that's one thing, we want to make sure is happening. And Rose, maybe you can speak a little bit on how, crisis centers can do that, especially with funding. That would be awesome.
Yeah, no, two things that when you mentioned that, I remember when we put when the bill was going through, I personally wanted so the presiding officer, that's the language in the statute, for basically in my mind is the SART coordinator. So I wanted to make it specific to someone that works at the sexual assault program as defined by chapter 4. Like I wanted to include all that. I lost that battle. So it can be anybody, and that's okay. It can be anybody because I do also know other SART coordinators who are not attached to a sexual assault program, and they're doing a really great job. So that was just my preference, is to have it there, but that's okay. Cause now in hindsight, it makes sense, but we still recommend that. But I do know that our advocates are stretched thin. Sexual assault
Yes.
advocacy, they are stretched thin.
Yeah. And we want to be mindful of that too, right? That y'all are stretched in, you're doing the work, you're talking to survivors day in and day out, right? And also there are ways for us, to have that be incorporated, but we want to make sure that y'all also feel comfortable. One way to do that, right, is in SARTs, not putting it all on the presiding officer or the coordinator, making sure you have a steering team. Like Rose was mentioning, we at the state level, we have a steering team and we meet, and it's a place where even though, I run those meetings, I'm also working with them and, collaborating, jumping ideas off. And that's what we want steering teams to look like for our local SARTs as well. And it gives the presiding officer, our coordinator, a support, right? And we want our steering team to reflect who also is at the table. So thinking about that. And a steering team can look like the coordinator and then maybe one or two co-chairs, depending on how big your community is, and then a few other folks as the rest of the members of the steering team. And then that way they can support for how the meetings are ran, how things are going to be done, if there's media requests, et cetera.
As you're saying that, I thought, oh my God, I accidentally, unintentionally, but I'm glad we did it. It ended up that way, did that. It's like the advocate, Tasa, we're the advocates. We started our statewide SART kind of, and I got all those people that were listed in the legislation, and we'll talk about more, but all those entities that are listed in that statute, I had them at the table to roll this out. It's so fun. I was just thinking about that. I was like, we kind of did that at the state level. You're right. And it is helpful because we would have been seeing, like I would have at that, before you were hired, I was a SART coordinator, if you will, because I was getting everyone together. But bringing everyone together, we kind of shared the workload in training and getting the word out and coming together with consistent language, so that whether it was going out to law enforcement or the county judges or the advocates or the nurses or whoever, we were all talking about it in the same way, but we shared that workload. So it's when you said that, I was like, oh my God, we kind of did that accidentally. Beautifully. Beautifully. But you said earlier about, we both said advocates, we don't have enough advocates to go around. I know, like when I talk to sexual assault programs, you don't have counselors. It's hard to find, sexual assault counselors. It's hard to find sexual assault advocates. And then the training is a whole nother thing. So, right, we have all that. So funding for that, I know that in the VOCA grant application this past year, I noticed that they included language to allow SART coordination. I don't know if anybody else saw that. So that was just one of the things that I wanted to put out there. Another thing, so TASA has, oh, we know we can't do that with that funding. Oh, SAPCS state. So your OAG funding, that's another, for those of you that get SAPCS state money, that might be another thing. If none of us have been awarded yet, so that should be happening. We'll see. July, not July. We're already in July. August, September. It starts September 1. So I think within the next few weeks, for those of you that have filled out your SAPCS state grant applications, you should be awarded. There's ways to do your budget adjustments to include different, positions, and maybe a SART coordinator could be one of those. But I wanted to ask in the audience, so who of you are from a sexual assault program and you're also leading the SART in your area? By show of hands. Okay. There's a few. Okay. How do you feel about that?
I feel okay. There's a few hands out there. And I think maybe, I think it's about figuring out what that looks like. For example, I was talking to a SART where just in the last few weeks, actually, where their coordinator was housed with their local PD. And even the coordinator themselves was kind of like, I don't know if it should be housed here. We had a SART prior to the bill. And so we're trying to figure that out. And it was mentioned, to the program that should be something that they should take on. And so I reached out to them. We were on a SART meeting and that got brought up. And I reached out to her and said, hey, why don't you and I talk one-on-one. So I can kind of tell you what this looks like, because it can be a lot for someone to tell you to do something like that in front of 20 people at a meeting. So let's really break down what that can look like. And so if folks are having, reservations about putting that on, we would be happy to talk to you more one-on-one. And that was a conversation I was able to kind of talk to them about what their band would look like. We were able to talk about funding and what could be some opportunities if that person took it on for the time being, if that is something in the next year, they could hire someone in particular that had that as part of their job. So just, it's one of those things where if we're just communicating and collaborating, we can help y'all figure out how that looks like for your agency and with your bandwidth, because we do want to protect that.
And I know that within the law, there's all these these items that need to be met. Like you have to, like the first year was you have to get with your county judge or county commissioner's court, get on their docket so they can, I don't know what it's called, bless the fact that you all exist as a SART, whatever that process is. I can't think of another word right now. And then there's the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step. Deepika, I've heard you talk about that, how beautifully that's happening across the state, but also how some may be kind of maybe overthinking it and kind of getting stuck in those things as opposed to like maybe the purpose. Is there anything you want to share about that experience, or how someone can like not get so stuck in the weeds of the language, but more of the spirit and the purpose of that law?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when people hear there's a deadline in the law, that can feel really scary. And so I just want to assure you, we're here to support when it comes to that. What I've been seeing, it's all across the board, right, with SARTs. Like I said before, we're almost at 50%. So there are a lot of counties that currently don't have SARTs, and that's going to be what we're going to be continuing to work on and connect with them so that way they can start that process. For the folks that are currently having SARTs, we are seeing that, sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit.
I wanted my time. I was like, oh, yeah, myself. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
So it's the purpose of the law. And
Yeah.
I've seen that too. Yes.
Yeah. So we've seen that too. So I think, people also were getting really, really stuck on just trying to get like their protocols done and working toward the biannual report. What does it look like to do a case review? Right. So that was kind of where folks are at right now, and it's across the gambit, right? Some folks are pretty close. Some folks have done their case review already. Some folks are working on their biannual report, and some people are still working on their bylaws and making sure that all the entities are at the table. And for me, I love to see that folks are still doing it, even if they feel like, oh, that deadline passed, and that's okay. They're still working together to collaborate. And that's where we come in and can support.
Absolutely. And so also with that, like what I've seen around the state is that when I go around and I talk, if I'm doing a training on something else, or maybe I'm talking with the sexual assault program about something totally different, and then SART comes up, the one thing that I've heard a lot is, oh, we have to do our case reviews. Like there's this intense focus on case reviews. And I think they're important, but I also think in my mind, I'm like, there are all these other things for the purpose of the SART.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And really, for the case review, it gives folks the opportunity to see how the protocols are working, right? Like that's really that point. I think also it's one adult case review per 2 years. So there's so much more that folks can be doing. It's not just what's in the law. Like think about the fact that you have everybody in the room that is working with sexual assault survivors. So you can look at, are there certain trainings that we need to make sure that the community is doing, right? Or is there certain outreach we should be doing to communities that haven't been reporting, that we haven't been seeing? Do we need to be thinking about what language access looks like, for example, in our community, right? And those are things that our SART teams can work together to do. If you're seeing a lot of survivors who are unhoused, what does it look like to make sure you're getting those resources? But we need to be talking about that, not just with the advocacy side, but what that looks like if a survivor who's unhoused comes to law enforcement to report, and then what is next? And those are the conversations you can be having in these SART meetings. I think one thing, that could be really great is maybe every year SARTs think about what are their top 3 goals, right? And then at the end of the year, it's the holidays, maybe have a party, get together, have some dips and chips and talk about how that worked, right? And then go into the next year thinking, okay, we want to do 3 new focus areas, or there was one thing that we were doing a lot of training in this specific area, and we think our community needs more. So let's keep that going and let's start with 2 new things. You can also have the opportunity to do different working groups. So you can work on healing or community outreach, data, all these different things that other folks can be involved with. I also want to stress, I know for people who are going to start, a lot of times it can be 1 or 2 folks from your agency that are involved, but maybe other people at your agency also want to be involved, but it can be a lot to have 4 or 5 people from the same agency and 1 SART meeting, but they can get involved by being in these working groups. That's where they can also be able to put in their input.
And it seems like that would be more buy-in too in the community.
Yeah.
Where they don't have to attend all these monthly meetings or whatever that cadence is for you all, but they can be impactful in this work group and influencing and informing some of the protocols and policies. So that seems kind of, I think that's a win-win there.
Like if you had a working group that was really focused on healing, and healing initiatives, you might have someone at your agency, maybe a counselor or an advocate that's really passionate about that, but isn't necessarily the person that is tapped to be going to the meeting, but their insight is so great and so fresh. And you want them to be coming to those committee meetings.
Another thing, Deepika, that I know when I've talked to you before, as we're just kind of debriefing on things as work days go, is I know that you feel very strongly, and I absolutely agree with you in that, we have the law and the statute and what's written as far as the parties that are to be at the table.
Yes.
But you feel, but there also is a clause in that law that says, or who the SART deems appropriate. Can you talk a little bit about who else that you feel, or what's the process? What process should folks be following to make sure that it's inclusive on the SART?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, yes, in the law, there are 6 mandated entities that need to be at the table: advocacy, law enforcement, the sheriff's office, the district attorney's office, a SANE or forensic nurse, and a mental health or behavioral health institution. But there's so many other folks that work with survivors and serve survivors that we also need to have at the table that are just as important. We need to have culturally specific organizations at the table. We need to think about, is there a university or a college in your town? Do we have folks from there at your table, right? And then also thinking, what is specifically going on in your community? So recently, Rose and I and a few other team members, we were in Alpine, which is beautiful, by the way. And we were out there, and one of the things that they were talking about is that Border Patrol was interacting with survivors. So maybe having a representative from there, like coming in. Another thing to think about too is having survivors at the table, right? We can't do this work in the movement without them, but also thinking about how to make that safe for those survivors. And that's something we want, because I'm thinking about it from a rural community perspective, right? I am from a town in Illinois of 20,000 people. I just recently went home and ran and didn't tell anyone except for who I was visiting. Literally ran into people every single day that we left the house and went anywhere. And that's 20,000, that's a town of 20,000 people, right? And some of these smaller rural communities, these counties, they have 2,000 people, 1,000 people. So, to think about going and reporting even, right, is, if I go to the law enforcement organization in that town, that might be my mom's best friend's cousin. So they might know me, right? So thinking about that, but also being mindful that it is important to have survivors at the table. So when you're putting together these SART teams, what are other organizations that are doing the work in your community? And I think we were talking about this a little bit last night.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was, I know you were saying there were some other organizations that were coming up for you too.
Yeah, I was thinking about that time. We were in Beaumont like 2 weeks ago. In Beaumont, is it Beaumont in the house? Where y'all at? Anybody? They're in the bed or eating breakfast. Okay. So we went to Beaumont a couple weeks ago and we did a training. It was TASA and TCFB, and we had like a day where we focused on sexual assault investigations, sexual assault response and advocacy. And then the next day was domestic violence. So they wanted both. And so we each had our day and we attended each other's workshops on the other day. So but what we did is we had a SART conversation. And so there was, I'm gonna say about 60 to 75 people. And so we broke them up and had them break up by discipline. And we're like, please, 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 I don't want all law enforcement at one table. There's a lot of law enforcement there, but
Yeah.
they obliged and they all split up. And what we found out is that there was folks from the Bureau of Prisons, Federal Bureau of Prisons there. There was folks from hospice. And at the end of the day, they were all saying, we need to be at the SART table.
Yeah.
And the hospice folks were like, we need to be at the SART table.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're not thinking about, right? Like really thinking about who is interacting with sexual assault survivors in your community, because they should be at the table too. They have a lot of important insight.
Yeah. And then, when I mentioned earlier about Gen Z and the younger generation or the coming of age, I think that I see Gen Z as the coming of age. You've got some that are, already, in their 20s or mid to early 20s. And then you have those that are teenagers getting out of high school. How do we incorporate them on SARTs? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we definitely do. We
Okay.
think about, are there folks that we know are doing the work, like we were talking about community organizing, or, are they doing stuff on social media that we know is serving survivors in the community when we're going to campus and working with them, who's coming from like the Title IX office or from their advocacy organizations or groups there. There, a lot of times on campus, there are organizations or volunteer groups, and those could be really important people to have at the table too. And that might be a way for us to get the younger generation.
And also, I know Deepika, when we first got this, and I know Liz and I went out and talked to a few people. So we went to, and I'll say, because I thought it was a beautiful conversation. We went to Coryell County. Anybody here from Coryell County? Oh, that's served. Oh, hey. So we went to Coryell County and we met with the county judge there. I don't know if he's still the county judge, but his name, the one that we met with was Roger. Oh gosh, what was his last? Roger Miller. Yes. Beautiful. He was the county judge, beautiful, beautiful person. And we met with him, and then we met with the chief of police of Coppers Cove. And Misty's in the room. Misty was there with us. She's with Aware Central Texas. Anyway, so we were all just there. And in that area, the beauty of it is that you have more than one advocacy organization. We have Families in Crisis, we have Aware Central Texas. And then I learned about a faith-based group that's in that area. And I thought we were talking about it. I was like, all three of them should be at the table, not only just our sexual assault program, but the faith-based group, because the folks are such, our survivors should be able to have that option. Like, no, I want to go to the sexual assault program, or no, you know what, I don't, whatever, for whatever they should be able to choose. So whatever option is available to them in the community, I think needs to be at that SART table. And that was just something that came out of Coryell County. But what was beautiful about what Judge Miller said is we were in the parking lot, he was still talking and he was getting excited about it. And he says, oh, so Rose, what you're basically saying at the root of this is if we're doing the SART right, an adult sexual assault survivor will not regret coming forward. And I was like, oh my God, that's it. I'm going to write that down, give you credit. But when he said that, I was like, that's exactly it.
Yeah. That's so powerful too.
So yeah, so I thought that was great. Okay, so Deepika, why do you feel? Oh, wait, let me see. No, we talked about that. Okay, so and this is upside down. I don't know if y'all can see that. Edie was like, Rose, let me reprint that because I don't know who it was. Do you remember that? Somebody was reading to children and it was upside down, and then there was like all these memes. So it's upside down because that's the way Edie printed it. I'm just kidding. Anyway, so let me look at what we wanted to talk about here. When you talked about the communication piece and how not only did that repair relationships, have you seen where, if you're comfortable sharing, where, maybe, someone had to be maybe switched out of that role? I'm just thinking of an example that even I worked with, and I won't say the county, but I worked within a county where they were just ineffective. Like they were not being invited and they were leading the SART.
Yeah.
And we're not being invited to their own. Anyway, it was really odd. And so they asked for our help. And so we did everything we could do. But even in their communication with us, there was confusion. And so we'd get there and I was like, I thought this was happening. And they were like, oh, I don't know. So I thought, this person's just ineffective. It's not the advocacy organization. It's not law enforcement. It's this person's ineffective. And I know that sounds harsh, but I'm saying, how do you feel like conflict resolution? What are your thoughts on that? What it looks like, how you deal with that within SARTs?
Yeah, that is such a great question. There's a lot there. I feel like we could probably talk for like hours about conflict resolution. That got brought up in my session yesterday, and I was like, do we need to do a separate 2 hours on that? And that's complicated, right? If someone is in leadership or is representing an entity and isn't effective, what does that look like? Part of it is having some one-on-one conversations, coming from a place of calling in, not calling out, right? And wanting to understand where they're coming from, maybe what's not working, there must be a disconnect. And then also thinking about, there are elections, and that's part of the reason we have those protocols and bylaws in place. Also thinking about maybe that means, we step away and we start from scratch and we build up. And by doing that, we're going to decide that we're going to utilize someone else from the community to run the SART or to come together. And coming from that place where it's not accusatory, but more of a conversation of what we can do next.
And in your work that you've done with SARTs, and maybe even at TASA and how you're working with SARTs across Texas, can you share a success story that involves a SART and an adult survivor of sexual assault?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I think is really powerful is the access that survivors can get when SARTs are functioning together. They can get connected to resources that they may not have been able to be connected before. I know when I was part of the SART, there was a case that had come in, and the law enforcement officer working with them, they were just from a community that needed interpretation, and it needed some really culturally specific, competent advocacy. And they didn't know necessarily what resources to give them. But because I had been going to the SART for multiple years at that point and had a relationship with that officer at the SART, because honestly, too, going to those SART meetings, it's all about networking and getting to know each other, and building that trust and that awareness. And so many great conversations happen after those meetings or before those meetings start, right? And so that person actually came to me and said, hey, like this is going on. Can we work together to support this SART or support the survivor? And then because that was something that they had brought to me, there was another resource that was also attending the SART. There was someone from the campus that was there, and that survivor's child had also suffered sexual assault, but was a university student. And so then we were able to connect them with them as well. And that's all because we were having these conversations in the SART. We were getting to know each other, and then we were able to work together directly.
As you say that, I was thinking of other folks at the table, like the food bank. And the reason why I bring that up is I remember as a hospital advocate once, I was the hospital with the advocate on call. And so there was a survivor that came in, and she was in survival mode, right?
Yeah.
She at this point, like she did the SANE exam. She didn't really want to do the SANE exam, but she's like, okay, I'll go ahead and do it. And then so as I was trying to like connect with her, because she was
Yeah.
really stressed and and I was like, is there anything, this is the question that I asked to finally relax her. I said,
Mm.
is there anything I can do to help right now?
Yeah.
Besides being here in this room, I think there's
Yeah.
something else that you need from me.
Yeah.
She was like, I need you to pick up my kids, and I need this to be done quick, because I need to go to work. I cannot lose this job, because who's going to feed my kids?
Yeah.
And it's just that she was more worried about so who's going to pick up her kids? Am I going to lose my job? Than the sexual assault.
Yeah.
And we all know that later, it might be a month, it might be a year, it might be a week, it's going to
Mhm.
hit her.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I was like, and then of course we had, where I was at, we had this rule that you can't drive survivors, which I think is dumb. But anyway, I mean, it's not dumb. It's just, as an advocate, I'm a real advocate. Like, I wanted to go pick up those kids.
Rose has some feelings about it. And I support you. I'm with you.
Luckily, law enforcement, she reported. So law
Okay.
enforcement, the victim, our system-based advocates, lovely people, they were able to go take care of those kids. Anyway, but
Good.
in that, I thought she was in survival mode, and she basically said something like, "You're going to feed my kids if I lose my job?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, I will." So anyway, it's just knowing that sometimes there are basic needs that need to be
Yeah.
met, and I'm thinking, or I wouldn't have ever thought of having some representation of organizations that fulfill basic needs to be at the table in case that ever comes
Yeah.
up.
And other needs like immigration,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Like thinking about, do you have a local agency, nonprofit, or other folks that are working with that are helping survivors? Are they at the table, right? Like, just thinking about all those organizations. And I love that food bank situation.
Maybe I
Thinking
just
about
love that.
that, like those are folks that should be involved.
And you mentioned earlier healing, because we know that there are various healing and therapy type of
Mhm.
modalities.
Yes.
So who in communities, and I mentioned faith-based, I think, there's folks that find healing in faith. And I
Mhm.
think that's wonderful. And I think there's folks that may find healing in sitting by the river, or being out in the nature. So how would you see incorporating the various modalities of healing? How does that intersect with SART, and what should that look like?
Yeah. So, one of the required entities is behavioral health. So making sure we have someone at the table for counseling and mental health, a mental health provider, but also thinking about what are organizations or folks in your communities that do alternate or cultural or different types of healing modalities, right? Like you were saying, going to the river. Is there someone in your community that does art therapy or music therapy with survivors? Those are folks that would also be really important to have at the table. They can have a different perspective on how it would be to work with that survivor and what they might need. It can be incredibly stressful, right? Going through a SANE exam and then going through, the whole legal system, and then having someone on SART that actually is like, hey, like I do dance therapy, and that survivor really connects that way and getting them that resource.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for sharing that. And so I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, why do you think SARTs are so important to our work?
I think that SARTs are so important to our work because that is where every entity that is working with survivors in their community is communicating with each other. And that's where we can really make sure that folks are working together. And I'm, going to speak from a personal place. I'm an adult sexual assault survivor. And when I was sexually assaulted, there was a lot of miscommunication that happened with my situation. There was an advocacy center where I'm from, and they did come to the hospital. They gave me a lot of support. But there was some sort of communication breakdown between law enforcement and the DA's office. My perpetrators were arrested the night that it happened, actually. But then, and and their family posted their bond, and they actually, their bond was given back to them by the district attorney's office. And because of that, they took that money and they fled and weren't prosecuted. And I was already going through the process of being prepped for trial and what that could look like. Which was really traumatizing, right? And I think about now, as I'm doing this work years later, about what that could have looked like if those organizations were talking to each other. There wasn't a SART in my community when this happened. But what if law enforcement and, the DA's office and the advocacy center had been talking to each other, and had, and the advocacy center had been able to say like, hey, like this is not going to work. Like, if you give them their money back, but do we know what's going to happen? Right. And there can be a lot of training that can be done on language because of the way that those entities were in my community. They weren't communicating, the way I was asked questions from different entities, law enforcement and other folks that I interacted with came from a lot of blaming language. Right. And they could have really benefited from having those conversations and getting training from advocates, but because they were so siloed and not communicating, I was asked, right? When I'm talking about what had happened, and they said, your perpetrators did say that sex happened. And I was like, but that was not consensual. But the language that they used, they said, well, that did occur. But what they could have benefited from is if all those entities were talking, they could have gotten more training on how to talk to a sexual assault survivor, especially when they're going through it.
So thank you for sharing that, Deepika. I think that's a very generous and beautiful thing for you to do, to share that piece of your story and how important it is for adult sexual assault survivors, because that's who this bill was intended to serve, as adult sexual assault survivors through SART and by mandating SART coverage in every county. So thank you for kind of bringing that home and letting us see this is the reality. The reality is this is a good real example of that. So Deepika, what, with everything that we've talked about, with the new law, with your experience in working with SARTs and with the plans that you have for the state of Texas, they're grand, y'all, they're grand.
I need to calm down.
What brings you hope in regards to SARTs and what they can do?
One thing that brings me hope is seeing all of y'all in this room that are so interested and wanting to know more about what SARTs can do in your community. That brings me a lot of hope. And just the fact that folks are starting to see the value of what SARTs can bring. And I'll tell you all, I'm going to hammer it home either way. So people are going to know.
That's right. You're going to hear from Deepika. So she will be in a town near you really soon. But Deepika, thank you so much. I know we're getting close to time, but I just thank you for indulging us and even having a coffee chat time to talk about SARTs. And I know that they were like SARTs, but I love talking about SARTs. I know you love talking about SARTs.
I do love talking about them.
And thank you all for listening to us talk about SARTs. If you all have any questions about anything when it comes to SARTs, policies, any bylaws, protocols, data, any of that stuff, please contact Deepika or contact anybody at TASA. We can get you in contact with Deepika. She really is a premier expert on this. And I think that the state is benefiting from her just being at TASA in this role. So thank you so much.
Thank you so
Deepika.
much. I also have a table over there with the exhibitors. So please come, feel free, stop by, chat with me. I would love to meet all of you.
All right. Oh, yes. Yes. We have a question.
Oh, a question. Yes.
Those that are like in healthcare or disabled people getting sexually assaulted and not going pregnant, and a lot of times it's boys. How do you think we can integrate the SART into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think connecting with those organizations that are serving those survivors are and we can talk more one-on-one too, but are they coming for, like, how are we knowing that those are happening? And so I think starting there, right? Like, now that you know that that's happening in your community, going to that organization and working with them and saying like, hey, we know that this is happening to folks that you're working with. We have this sexual assault response team in our community that works with folks, that works together, has all the entities at the table that are working with sexual survivors. So we'd love to have you there too, so we can have those conversations. It also could be having a few members of your SART team reaching out and meeting with them and seeing how they could work together with them, and then seeing what the best fit is.
And for the virtual audience, the question was, how do we incorporate organizations who work with individuals that are disabled? Like I know it was Lavinia Masters that said that she has been in contact with various entities where you have folks with individual disabilities who end up, pregnant, and we know what happened there. So how do we make sure that we work with those organizations for those particular survivors? So that was a good question. Thank you, Lavinia. Thank you. Okay, y'all.
All
So
right,
I don't know if
y'all.
there's still coffee, but I know there's water, and there's a nice row of sessions coming up. So we'll see y'all there, and then we'll see you back. I think it's back here for lunch. We have a beautiful luncheon planned for you all. I hope that you all make it back, and we'll see you soon. Oh, and raffle tickets.
Yeah.
Raffle tickets.
Raffle
Let's go play
tickets.
raffle tickets. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being here. We will be ending this session. Don't forget to do evaluations. I also included Deepika's email if you need it. And please go to the other workshops. Thank you so much. We'll see you in the afternoon for our keynote speaker. That is going to be great. Have a wonderful day. And again, thank you so much for being part of TASA. We appreciate you that you are here virtually, and I hope you're able to come to one of the conferences in person. See you all. Thank you again for being here. Bye-bye. Thank you. Gabriela, thank you, Susana, for your interpretation. We appreciate you both as well. Bye, everyone.